Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Ayal Shai. Today, my guest is Pamela Hobart. Hi, Pamela.
Hi.
It's really good to have you here. And
What?
as the custom goes, I'd love for you to take us right into today's topic of discussion.
Yes. Well, I think the topic that we had in mind for today is basically understanding negative emotions and what role they play in life, and whether our reactions to them are fixed or malleable, and whether they're helpful or not.
So, yeah, as soon as we corresponded over the topic of discussion, I was fascinated with this topic. And I just want to plant a flag and say that even the adjective negative that is put or glued to these emotions, like that's something I'd like to address for us to discuss. But maybe start at the beginning and kind of see in your journey that took you to the point where you're dealing with that topic. What are some of the feelings and thoughts that made you that prompted you to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, although I could call it understanding negative emotions now as sort of like a concept or a theme, it's only in retrospect that I realized that I've learned it and relearned it many times, sort of in different contexts over the course of my life. And the first big confrontation with negative feelings and how they work and how we have to like make our peace with them in some sense was when I was a teenager, because I have obsessive compulsive disorder, like contamination issues. And for a lot of people that sort of starts up around puberty, like your hormones are all weird and like you're getting anxious in various ways, and it's a time when stuff like this can present. So I started getting like really obsessed with just things being dirty, which is so common. It's like the cliche, like punchline of a joke. I would like take pens or markers to school, and if anyone touched them, I would like take it back and throw it in the trash, or like take it home and wash it in the sink. And like this is not normal behavior. I got obsessed with things that are irrational in some sense, like that don't attach to reality. Like there was a store that I decided everything that came from it was like dirty and I wanted it out
Hmm.
of my closet, but like there was nothing actually wrong with the store and clothes are washable. So I knew this wasn't normal, and I it took some years of trial and error, but I eventually landed in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a common treatment for OCD, and it involved what you would call exposure therapy, exposure and response prevention. So the idea is that there's like a certain amount of talking you can do about these aversive feelings and the anxiety that surrounds OCD. Like you can sit across from a therapist and say, I realize the clothes from that store aren't dirty, or like the pens are safe. If I put a pen that someone else used in my backpack, it doesn't ruin the backpack. It doesn't ruin my room at home. Like that's like magical thinking that doesn't attach to reality. There's the evolutionary component, which is like you have this module that's attuned to microbes or something, and yours is like
Hmm.
yours is in overdrive. It's like not actually protecting you from microbes, it's like protecting you from being around people, which is actually something you want. That's good. Not a
Right.
protection at all. And so you do that there, but you talk about that stuff, it sort of does something, but it tends to not be enough. and that if you really want to get better over time at being less OCD, that you need the behavioral component, which is basically getting untrained to feel averse to random, not actually unsafe things. And that's what exposure therapy is about. So, usually, in order to agree to the exposure therapy, it helps to have some understanding of like that's how this stuff works, because exposure therapy is very painful and it's painful on purpose. Like
Right.
my therapist would have me bring things like physically to the office that I had decided were unclean or no longer good. Like there was a bottle of lotion around this time. I remember it smelled good. It like wasn't cheap. It was like a nice bottle of lotion, but I had had the thought that like maybe there was urine or bleach in it or something. There was no reason to think this, but I
Mm-hmm.
had the thought and I was behaving like the thought was true. Like I was not no longer using the lotion and wanted to throw it away. And so you do something in the office that's like, okay, open the lotion, like put it on your hands, see how it feels. And I mean, it feels terrible. It doesn't feel good. Like, you don't realize in that instant that it's safe. Like, your body has these like somatic patterns and like anxiety patterns that are telling you like this is not safe, everything you touch now is getting dirty, like it's on your skin, it's spreading, it's going to like get on the car and it's on your shirt, and like it feels terrible. But exposure works slowly, which is that each time you lean into the OCD related anxiety, instead of grasping at straws to make it go away, you
Mm-hmm.
reinforce the place you're trying to go, which is that I can encounter things that my OCD brain has decided are unsafe, and I can make a choice for reasons, rather than get worse, which is like wash every time, which teaches you that you cannot tolerate the anxiety, you cannot tolerate the fake dirt. Like you have to do something. The problem with having to do something is that that's a downward spiral. Like it doesn't stay the same. You go from like washing your hands a little more than someone else to like showering 8 times a day and like bleaching everything every time you come home and whatever. It's not like a stable equilibrium. So you have to move from that anxiety place to the like, I can tolerate the anxiety place. Um, and around this time, like the therapy does work, like in weeks and months, not years and years. But I began to realize subconsciously or to some degree consciously that the success was not what you would hope. It's not like you get cured and then you
Mm-hmm.
never have weird OCD thoughts again. I have weird OCD thoughts all the time, like still all day long, every day. Um, but I don't feel the compulsion often. I don't often feel a compulsion to do much about them.
Right.
And that's the success. But like, it's very depressing to realize that success is kind of modest, um,
Mm-hmm.
in this way, and that you will still have sort of thoughts and emotions that are aversive. It's just there's something you can like kind of live around. And that was the
Yeah.
first learning of this.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really strikes a chord in my personal life. Having lost my mom at age 10, I kind of thought as a kid, you can naively think it was like, well, this is something that happens every 10 years or something, right? Like you think it's a pattern, even though it's only happened once because your life was short up until then, and you don't really have an idea about how life is not actually like that. So you just anticipate another blow at any time. And so I just want to say that for me as well, it's something that I found out that I'm no longer depressed and really obsessed with these thoughts. It's not that they don't come. Like I actually often think about my wife and daughter getting killed on the road or in some way. Okay. It arises in my mind, but I learned in a kind of a CBT way, and I haven't gone to CBT therapy, but I think it's quite similar to just kind of subvert that instinctively into appreciating what I have, and understanding that I have a lot to be grateful at this moment, and not try to push away the thought, not try to give myself magical thinking solutions like, oh, this isn't going to happen. No, I know it can happen. It has happened. It will happen to other people. It might happen to me. But the absolutely best thing that I can do with these thoughts is at least turn them into something that makes gratefulness arise.
Mhm.
um, yeah, it's also, I just find it fascinating with whether it's OCD, anxiety, maybe anorexia, and a lot of the behaviors that are very obsessed about control in some way. That it's very interesting that us as humans have this tendency of taking things that are rational in the sense that you do want to have a clean enough environment, right? You do want to have a good enough uh, environment that you're in, right? You do want to have a good enough diet. It, it's quite an amazing skill that we take these things and instead we put them in categories that are so black and white that make us lose our mind and in essence make us handicapped.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I don't know what do you think about
You're
that?
so right. I've often joked that, like, in my work as a philosophical coach, where I talk with people about stuff like this, that, like, it's all pushing against black and white thinking. Like, virtually every aspect of the work that we do could be described in terms of resisting that impulse. And, like, so many of us have the kind of maximization algorithm in there, and
Yeah.
we want to apply it to something. And for some people, it may be control over their body or control over their environment. Sometimes people get it over, like, being productive and useful. And some people, I've worked with a number of clients who are involved with, like, the effective altruist movement, where it started in a very good place. Like, they want to do good and not, like, waste charity dollars. And it very quickly can do the maximization thing and become like,
Hmm.
my purpose is to maximize, in, like, narrow terms, how many lives I save with my money that I'm also maximizing,
Right.
and it just goes crazy. And um, I, I I had an experience with this. I hadn't even thought about it in connection with this topic, but you're reminding me that I was vegan for about a year, about 10 years ago. I was vegan for a year, and I did it because I had adopted my first dog. And this dog, it was very obvious to me that he had separation anxiety, like, from being through the shelter and stuff. And he would absolutely lose his mind every time I picked up my keys. Like, no matter how long I was gone, he would tear everything up and just drool. And it was obvious to me that he was having, like, a panic attack. And I was very, it was very relatable because I was sort of fresh in recovery, as far as that is possible, from OCD. And that brought home to me, like, what it means to say, oh, if you eat pigs, you eat bacon, whatever. Like, pigs are at least as smart as dogs. So, like, you've sort of participated in this system that tortures pigs, and you have this dog in your house that you're treating in this really special way. Like, he had health insurance. Like, if you're trying to be consistent and, like,
Right.
rational, that is very hard to uphold. And so I became vegan. But by the time a year was up, not only was I unsure of how good it was for me physically, but I noticed that all those purity and maximization things were going. It was like, oh, should I give away all the leather? Oh, I'm sitting in a restaurant that, like, has particles of, like, egg and milk on the table, and, like, now they're on me. And it was threatening to interact with that capacity, for better or
Hmm.
for worse, that I have. And so I had to I had to quit. I pretty much quit cold turkey because it was, like, really threatening to be a black hole that would suck up all my emotional energy, not unlike hand washing or arranging the environment.
Yeah. I mean, purity, I was just kind of thinking about that concept and of how human it is, how nothing is in essence pure in nature, and it's just something that we impose, that we're able to create, come up with in our minds and just impose on nature, trying to find purity all of a sudden, where it's just not a thing that's a thing. You know, very rarely you're going to find a pure diamond or something. But
Mhm. Mhm.
and I was just trying to think as an exercise with myself. It's like, has the notion of purity ever brought anything good to the world? And I was like, I really doubt it. You know, I really doubt
Right.
it. I think that the notion that everything should be clean enough, good enough,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so on. The enough part is like we hate it so much, but it's so good for us to stick to that.
You're totally right. Yeah. We could say, if you wanted to put that in like philosopher terms, it's like purity is not a natural kind, or it's like not a concept that is sort of like knit into reality. Instead, it is a judgment based on standards that are themselves relative to the purpose at hand and relative to, you know, human biology or whatever. So, like, if food is, even they go through this when they're like inspecting food, right? The food that you buy, like cereal in a box, is allowed to have insects in it. There are
Right,
insect parts in there, but people imagine that, like, because the factory was inspected, like these ones are perfectly clean. And when once in a while you open up the bag and there's like a fly in it or something, you like, oh, you complain and you like go on social media, like, oh, this one's tainted. But that doesn't make contact with reality. And one fly in it also, though it's off putting, does not make it unsafe for human consumption. And so that's another thing that I see as a hallmark of my personal philosophical life and also my work with clients is that it is okay to have a standard that's somewhere in that gray area that is a real standard, like I'll eat the cereal that has one fly, I won't eat the one that's like moldy, or you know, like that's a gray area where we
right.
make a judgment. You don't have to give up the whole idea of like eating cleanly, or maybe we get new information like some kinds of plastics are not safe to eat food from. Okay, so we change the standard, but the standard is still within the domain of like this gray area stuff that is sort of not pin downable once and for all. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if I'm making the connection, is it, if we go back to the subject of feelings and how they are not necessarily to be avoided or to become impediments to our progress? I mean, uh, it's very clear by now that we can see that this is another kind of purity, right? To want to feel the positive feelings, the so-called positive. Again, I have my own kind of problems with even labeling negative or
Sure,
positive, because context matters. You know, if
sure.
you're faced with a tiger, boy, do you want to feel fearful. If you're faced with somebody who's going to mug you, boy, do you want to feel angry and indignant, right? um, but this is in essence, right, what a lot of people are, is the pitfall that they encounter, is wanting to be riding the wave all the time, right, and
Hmm.
never getting off it. So in terms of your story, how does it connect there?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think my experiences with OCD and later my experiences with grief. I lost my father a few years ago. They turned me into sort of the opposite of maybe what's more normal, which they turned me into a wallower in negative feelings. Kind of like
Hmm.
I recognize I'm not going to make them go away, even when I'm not having like OCD crises. I'm like a moody person with a low baseline, a low hedonic baseline. And so maybe I went black and white with that in the other direction, which is like the happy thing is not available for me. It's not available for me pre cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not available post cognitive therapy. To whatever extent I was happier then, like, okay, people are just going to die, and that my dog died, the one who helped me become temporarily vegan,
Mm.
and um and so I didn't try to do that thing, which was push them away. push the negative emotions away, or like wait for a time when they sort of go away so that I can be like focused and enjoying what I'm doing or whatever. Um, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that maybe I'm too far in the other direction, like sort of too modest in expectations about like what kinds or flavors of happiness or contentment or satisfaction or even just like kind of calm might be available, might be available in life. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I personally remember very clearly that coming out of depression in my late teens was just like a moment where I decided to, yeah, I have to expose myself, talking about exposure, expose myself to the possibilities, because I'm not allowing myself to live, right? Just thinking about all the bad things that are going to happen and identifying with them. So this is something we haven't mentioned explicitly, but I feel like a lot of the benefit, like for example, for meditation that can come, is decoupling this identification, this identity, and the thoughts that are thought, or by any other means that you can find, you know. And there are stoic techniques to do this, and some people use psychedelics with a guide, whatever helps. But decoupling identity from thoughts is a big help, and then really being able to almost give up in a sense in the face of the universe, kind of sending its cosmic rays through you, understanding that cosmic rays are cosmic rays. They're going to go through you, you know. Thinking about kind of blocking them away by doing that. I mean, thankfully we have our beautiful atmosphere to do some of that, but still it's happening, you know. And we get bombarded with UV light, we get bombarded with other particles, and we degrade, and we are not going to be in perfect condition, neither mentally nor physically. And yeah, coming to terms um, with this understanding is not easy, especially when we live in a culture where there is such strong emphasis on just finding the next wave to ride, right? And not only that, you're almost being mocked for not being in that position, either by your peers, who are not actively mocking you, of course, but are just doing their thing in order to um, portray a life of happiness and all that, or by companies who just make you feel inadequate, and as if you're wasting your life away, feeling not only the best feelings.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's it's all of the things you're describing here are why it seems to me that like if I were to describe the idea that we were going to talk about today, you know, like negative emotions, how you should like do what's valuable even if they're around, or don't try to be too happy, stuff like that. It sounds like trivial on paper. Like, of course, you know, who would be like waiting around to feel good before they like live their life? Or who would have the expectation that they would be happy all the time? Because when you put a point on it, it sounds absurd, but the way it shows up in everyday life is much more subtle. Um, it's much more subtle, and all the time we're sort of training ourselves to move towards and away things, which maybe is to your point that you don't like the label of negative and positive emotions because it's, you know, clearly more complex than that. And so to capture them moving towards or awayness, the term is kind of better to say aversive. Like aversive emotions are the ones, whatever's in there that you're sort of repelled by.
Hmm.
And non-aversive emotions are the ones that you're sort of like, ooh, yeah, more of that, you know, the chocolate or the sex or whatever, the buying stuff. And when we think of it more in terms of aversive or not aversive, it immediately opens up reconceptualizations of that, because like anger, for instance, is one that some people experience as quite aversive. Like if you're conflict avoidant, or if you have a self-image that like you're not an angry person, if you start feeling angry, you're like, oh no. But other people like run on their own anger and use it as sort of an identity tool and are like too enmeshed in feeling and behaving that way, and they don't experience that flush of anger as being aversive at all. And maybe that's in that context part of the problem. But There's this psychologist I like. I read him a lot. His name is Nick Wignall. I'll give you the link or whatever.
Sure.
He he writes about how the way he describes it is that when you have a thought that's initially aversive, or you consider an action that's initially aversive, like, oh, someone will die, or like my skin is being damaged every day by the sun, or whatever, like the the aversion amounts to either suppressing it, like, don't think about it, don't think about it, or you could try to do something to make it go away. Like, oh, if you buy this special detox sunscreen, then like
Mm,
you will be safe and your skin will like heal itself. And if you read a statistic about how rare car accidents are, then you can like argue your way into thinking it's false that your loved ones will ever die in a car accident. Those are like compulsions sort of on the same spectrum as OCD stuff, though they're not all the way clinical. Every time you do that, either suppress or try to solve it, you teach yourself that it's unsafe to have negative emotions. And you make it so that the next time it's even more automatic to suppress or solve. And you get in that same OCD type feedback thing where you have no psychological flexibility around like where the flexible response is that bad thing might happen. And yes, my skin's sort of damaged. And I can sort of do some things about that, like drive safely and have a safe car and wear sunscreen, but it's not a guarantee. And I'm going to choose, once the reasonable actions are exhausted, I'm going to choose to feel gratitude and to sort of rest in my understanding of that humans are flesh and blood and mortal. You know, like that just involves so much more flexibility and complexity than the trained thing of suppress or solve. I could nickname it as. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. I think it's so important to just make it the natural um, way that things flow in your mind, that you just take a negative thing that could get you in a loop and you just turn it into a positive, which is true. It's not, you're not tricking yourself when you say, well, the sun's rays are hitting me. That's all the more reason to really live your life the way you want to live them, right? And not wait and think about how you can spend 30 years doing something that you don't really love for some sort of obscure payoff in the end. Um, so that I already mentioned that, and I do think that's extremely important to do. And also, for me personally, something that was very helpful is once I started seeing the emotions arising not as part of a bigger pattern, right? There's something that is up one level from emotions, that is up one level from thoughts, that is up one level from desires, let's say, and that's our psyche as a whole, and maybe even as a bigger whole if you join the body to create a body mind. And that thing ultimately, I think you just realize that by being so concerned with all the things that make your psyche or your body not right, whether it's a physical illness that you're trying to avoid with all your might, um, or a mental state that you're trying to avoid at all costs, and you realize that the very attempt is actually causing the body mind to be unhealthy. Once you understand that mental health is a process, right? And of course, we know this very simply from just physical health. If you take a snapshot of, let's say, um, my blood results, right? They can be very different from in a 2 hour window, right? It could be low before I eat and very, very high. Now, according to this one snapshot, you could extrapolate and say, wow, this person is unhealthy, right? Of course, we know it's actually a process and this is a healthy thing. It rises and then it goes down and so on. And once you understand that, I think you can gain an understanding about emotions that it's healthy if they are fitting, if they sit well with reality. It's unhealthy if it's completely decoupled, and let's say you are all the time depressed, or if we go to like Hippocratic, the humors, the four humors theory, they would tell people that have too much blood, supposedly in that theory, that they're too optimistic. And I get that we don't get that illness that often anymore.
Right.
But
Right.
apparently there are people who can be like overly optimistic about things to their own detriment.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge can of worms, but I feel like there's something that was lost when we narrowly like medicalized mental health, like turning it into a medical thing has benefits, but it also has costs. And some of the benefits, I mean, arguably accrue to the people who are like the most ill, like who really need heavy duty, like medication and intensive treatments of whatever kind, whether those in fact work or how well is up for debate. But a lot of people somewhere in the middle where like they're not completely well, the snapshots are iffy, the overall picture is maybe not ideal. Um, they get sucked in at the margin to the medicalized view, which is like there's something wrong with the neurotransmitters in there or whatever, which is like that whole theory is not substantiated and they don't really know how SSRIs work anyway. And so it's like if we had sort of more of an enchanted view where like your humors are out of whack, or like maybe some people just sort of come with different combinations and they like temper it where they can, but fundamentally you're just of that kind and it's sort of okay as long as it's okay. um, is like more of a playful and appropriately mysterious lens for what's going on in there, which is like a thing is only a problem if it's a problem. Like if you're just kind of constitutionally negative and dour, but you make your way in life and you have your coping mechanisms and stuff, like that's fine. You don't maybe need this label that is like you're broken. And by the way, there's a healed version of you that's within reach. And if you got there, then you'd be happy all the time and you'd have more success and blah, blah, blah. Like that's just people are just imagining that. Like in what sense is that possibility real? Like it seems quite unreal. And the more you go down self-development and personal improvement and mental health treatment and you never find it, the less real you should think that perfect version of yourself is. But people almost like hunker down like obsessively over like, well, I must just have tried the wrong modality, or like if I just
Yeah.
keep going. um,
Yeah, I mean, for me in my own life, it took a long time to really finally and for good decouple um, mental health from feeling any specific emotion. It's actually hard to do because um, we're wired so early to associate living well with feeling good feelings or feeling these wanted feelings. And I think that only when you understand what being mentally healthy is, and only when you reach that point, you can unlock for yourself the knowledge of what it feels like. It's right and as long as you think that mental health is feeling all these very specific set of emotions, then your focus is not mental health. Your craving, which is, of course, we know from Buddhism and other things, just like craving is not good for you, it creates suffering in itself. So you're not mentally well for as long as you're in that mindset. And so you have no knowledge of what being mentally healthy is. Now, if we just define mental health as the absence of psychic issues, which it's true that that's all health is. It's not even a it needs not be defined by the positive things. It's really the absence of illness. And it sounds boring to people. They don't want
right.
that. They don't want that. It's and within the context of our culture, it makes sense. They don't want just to have the absence of illness. Even though once you get there, and I'm a work in progress. We all are. But once you get to a good enough point, and we should focus on the enough, feels great.
Right. Yeah, it depends where you're coming from, you know? Like if someone has no psychic issues of note, but sort of like has that wondering if there's more, or like, can I make these peak experiences like more frequent or longer lasting or something? And you tell them like, nope, this is pretty much it. Like they would be disappointed. But if you take someone like me or maybe you who's like had some turmoil or whatever, and it's like that's sort of the goal, like, okay, yeah, all right, I could be okay with that. That sounds pretty good. um, to merely have the absence of discrete psychic issues or long lasting negative emotions, aversive.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just playing on a different axis altogether because we're just so used to this, almost like the HAG machine with the heart going up and down. You know, we look at that axis of like we want to be at the peaks, like find new peaks all the time. I think when you're mentally healthy and you can look back a week, a month, a year, and tell yourself, well, I haven't experienced a lot of internal strife. And again, that's not saying that I haven't had these um, really thoughts that, yeah, even today, I would rather not thought about, I would rather not think about my loved ones dying. But that's not it. That's not what makes you ill. What makes you ill is, again, the response or the loops that you might fall into. If you can look back and say, well, I haven't been in conflict with myself. It was pretty easy for me to choose whether to take the job that wasn't good for me but paid really well. And I just said no because that's how I felt, and I went for it, and I believe in my capability of just living with less money but more time on my hands, let's say. If you get to that point, then I think the axis that you're looking at is different. It's a lot more about like depth and accumulation of really good days, and it affects your soul in just a different way. It's not about a peak anymore. It's about how far you've gone into this ocean of experience and what you found and what people you met and how much you have to be grateful for all the time that you've been well now. Um, yeah, it's just different, and you don't get to navigate that space if you keep riding the good old wave of just looking for new peaks in terms of excitement and happiness.
Mhm. Yeah, you're reminding me of this blog post I wrote a while back. And I think its title is Eat the Cheese Plate. And I was reaching for like an analogy that would describe this kind of different axis or like kind of a different standard or game to be playing all together. And so the analogy of a cheese plate is like, you go to a nice restaurant and they bring you cheese at dessert or whatever, and you know what they look like. Like it has, like a blue moldy cheese and like a hard one and a soft one. And there are like crackers with weird seeds in them and like some fruit. And there's like a tiny, tiny, tiny little pot of jelly that you're supposed to put with the sour cheese for contrast, whatever. And it's like if you are always reaching for just this kind of pure emotional and positive or easily non-aversive emotions, it's like you went to that cheese plate with all its sort of diversity and flavors, and you picked up the tiny pot of jelly and you're like sucking it down, right, like a kid, because you have no appreciation for that all those experiences are sort of part of the thing that is eating a cheese plate. And maybe you sort of quote unquote like some of them more than others. And many of us, there might be one that you like genuinely just in no uncertain terms dislike. But you like miss the point if you're just eating the jelly. And what that analogy misses is that, at least in the cheese plate experience, you're active, like you're not having to endure any of those, you're making a choice. But in life that's not true. Like when you lose a loved one or you lose a job or stuff like that, you do get some of those different flavors that are very mixed and difficult to grapple with at times, you do get those forced upon you. So it's like life is taking the moldy cheese, and it's like you can either
Mm,
learn to appreciate it for what it
right.
is, hopefully in a mix of other things usually, or like you just will be suffering.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's I like the yeah, the image there. Yeah, I'd like to ask you about your story again, dealing with OCD and coming out of it to the best of your ability and to the best of, you know, getting to where you are. Do you feel that there have been watershed moments that are just kind of insights falling into place, or is it the true gradual improvement that is also, in a sense, anticlimactic? And I'm really interested if what was the more driving factor there, like kind of um, insights at very specific points in time, or the gradual process, or is it peaks interspersed through time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I'm sure there were moments of what felt like insight, and they were not fake or illusory, but they are not were not for me the fuel of progress. The fuel of progress was the very anticlimactic and mundane thing of waking up every day with some provisional commitment to like not doing OCD things. And of course, some days I fell short of like my intermediate goal. Like maybe I would wash too much, or what avoid, maybe like hold my pee instead of going in a bathroom I wasn't sure that was clean or whatever. Like, but the good news is that there's so many choices every day to either do the new thing that's hard or do the old thing, which is also hard in its own ways, but is just the path of least resistance. So it was basically a long slog, but there were times when I noticed that I was making progress that sometimes can be easy to miss in the moment. So like I was thinking of transferring colleges, and going to the new college was going to involve like riding the commuter rail, the subway, like downtown to downtown Atlanta. And I did it once, and I was in the subway car. And at the time, I was just like driving my private car around. And so being in the subway car, like with people coughing and like gum stuck to the floor and stuff, I was just like, I
Your
really couldn't
worst
do this.
nightmare.
Yeah, like I couldn't do it. There's a meaningful sense in which like this is so far out of my range of abilities that like I would not be able to get to focus in class, or like I would maybe even not go, and like, but I did it. I did switch. I sort of like in a brave moment decided to accept the challenge. Like this is a thing that normal people do, and I mean normal people don't love the gum on the floor or like the sniffling strangers, but it's sort of all things considered like a reasonable thing to do for most people. Um, and I've escalated many times since there at things that are very obvious to me that I wouldn't have been able to do like when I was really in the hole around 18 or 20 years old. Like I moved to New York City. Of course, the subway was like way dirtier, and like everything's old and gross. And like you move into these very expensive apartments that are like really not nothing special. It's not like new construction. It's got like 12 coats of paint on it. And the paint, I would like imagine that the paint was full of previous occupants like skin cells and their saliva cells and whatever. And like when you're in that headspace, it just feels like the building is burning around you, like hot, like just it's just so dirty
Mm.
and so distracting. And I still get thoughts like this and even shades of the experience. Like recently we bought a house, and it's not new. We bought a house here in Austin that's was built in 1997. And there are like smears of things around. The house is in nice condition. Like there's no one reasonable would be like, I couldn't live in this house. But if you look, there are like smears and smudges, and I went to paint it, and then I'm imagining the paint is full of my spit. And like it it's the same old stuff. It's exactly the same
Hmm.
old stuff. It's this thoughts that I was talking about with my therapist like the better part of 20 years ago. And so it's sort of sad to realize that I can never be free of that. I can never be free of that in the way I would like to, which is to not have those thoughts, but I can be free of it in the way that like I'm going to move into this nice house and paint the walls and like pretty much enjoy it in the way that is possible. Pretty much. It's not the same as someone else's enjoyment, but it's better than the alternative.
And these others, they have their departments in life, you know, where
Yeah.
they probably can't enjoy it as much as you are. But you're so right. I mean, every time that, I mean, these moments of bravery, you know, that I can do this, and I can, discovering something new about yourself, that's progress, right? That's progress, because it really doesn't matter if for another person this is super easy. What matters is that you've made progress, and now you have, come closer to, again, mental health, which is, a process over time of just sustainability, and an ability to, to keep the ball rolling, basically. And you mentioned how, OCD is not easy to do. Of course, like for me, that would be hard. I don't even like washing dishes, you know. So it's like, of course, I would hate it, and other people would hate it, and that's something that struck me as well at some point in my life. I remember thinking, I'm also not a hard worker. Just not a fan of work ethic. It's not my thing. I think we're here to, like, living well is not going to come about if that's the thing we optimize for. Again, like the other things we mentioned, and yet I recognize there are workaholics that, to them, that's that's not only easy. That's the easy thing, because that's their baseline behavior. That's the default,
Mhm.
and I think recognizing that about people is, first of all, comical, just as a species. You know that it can be, something can be so hard for me and so easy for this other person who might very well be at the other unhealthy extreme, and it really makes it easier to understand that progress is about what you can do for yourself. And, lately, I've been really coming to terms with the idea, or kind of the idea really sank in for me, that, any athlete, any person who's won a lot, who's successful in the mainstream way, probably the businessman, the best businessman, the best whatever, really, not only does it not tell you anything about their, psyche and how well it does, it is actually more likely that they are traumatized from a young age. I think studies show that, elite athletes are more likely to have suffered childhood trauma. Um, so, yeah, just the more you look at it, the more you see that there is no place for comparison, envy, or anything of the like. Let's just look after ourselves and make sure that wherever we are, we can be a little bit better tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, it's the narratives around these things are so complicated and even contradictory. It's like, okay, well, don't compare yourself to other people, but also like you're behind at life and they're doing this thing you aren't doing. And this thread about neurodivergence, I even like say that kind of lightly because the whole neurodivergence thing was initially a way to like talk about people who were out of the norm, just like statistically in kind of a non stigmatizing way, which, like, fine. That's totally fine. But it's kind of gotten a life of its own, especially online, like in memes and on TikTok or whatever, which is like sometimes people who are different in whatever way, and I get to say this because I'm one of them. Sometimes you sort of want to say, oh, this is more like a disability or an illness. My OCD is like cancer. Like I didn't do anything to catch it. It was sort of not going into remission. I have to like live with it, whatever. But then at other times, it's gotten oversold, which is like whatever your neurodivergences are actually superpowers. And if you only like reframe it enough, then you will see the mirror flip side of that anxiety, which is like, oh, but you're like really careful at grammar or something like that. And it's just such a good example of the black and white thing, which is like, no, your childhood trauma, it didn't either ruin your life or make you a star athlete. Like it's always a mixed bag. And we might make some conjectures about like some types of mental unwellness are like less of a mixed bag than others. Some of them are more like just straight up disability and don't provide meaningful avenues for kind of working in self development, right? And then others are more like a gray area. Uh, one of my if I had a hidden superpower from all this OCD bullshit, it's that many many new mothers like who've just given birth to a first child are absolutely horrified to be noticing intrusive thoughts for the first time. So like you come home from the hospital, you've been
Mm.
awake for like 10 days and the baby's like screaming and you're like physically all banged up in whatever way, whatever horrible ways. And they would have thoughts like, oh my God, did I forget to feed the baby? Or like, am I going to drop the baby? And this totally happened to me when I brought home my first and second and third child. But like I was so used to just paying excessive attention to like random scary thoughts or even kind of nonsensical thoughts that it was like nothing. I had sort of already paid those dues. Like when I was thinking of adopting my first dog, I had thoughts like, what if I put rat poison in his water? Or like, what if I woke up in the middle of the night and just like took a knife out of the kitchen and like stabbed him and killed him? But like, so I'd been through all of it many times before. And so that was at least this occasional opportunity to compare and be like, oh, I've been there. I know what this is. I know this face of human life. And it is the face of like a brain that just does combinations and just tries stuff out all the time, but some of us pay more attention to some of that than others. I mean, this is what I think regret is too. Like some people have this mental model of regret as like if you feel a regret over something, it's probably important. Like probably you need to think about it and revisit it and like learn the lesson and whatever. But because of my experiences, I'm like, regret is just like your brain is like mixing the soup around and just recombinating things, and maybe it means something and maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe it feels bad and like you don't have to do anything. It's really
Yeah,
at the end of the day.
yeah.
Maybe it feels bad and you don't have to do something.
Yeah, regret was actually one of the episodes that I released with Etienne Fortuet Dubois, and yeah, to me, I think you're right. Like, we don't need to make a whole mountain out of any small thing. Um, yeah, like specifically regret, I think, if you look at it from evolutionary terms, then it does make sense that it's something that's kind of just indicating and maybe priming you to consider other options the next time you're going to come across some similar decision there. But exactly, it takes another interpretation on top of that to make it a negative emotion, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
it can be just a learning experience. As a tour guide, I noticed this with feedback. I make sure that I ask people for feedback, and very fortunately or thankfully or whatnot, like usually the feedback is great. But in the few times that people have something to say, it's never fun to get negative feedback. And this is another instance where I just realized that this is kind of a door that opens into a room that you don't really, maybe there's some ugly stuff there or something, but this is exactly the opportunity for us to have a blind spot illuminated for us, which is amazing. And now I can go and work in that, and it's my opportunity to finally go into the room, find it that it's not haunted, and start organizing things around. So um, yeah, it ties back to the whole discussion before of finding the solutions to the problems instead of just staying very focused on the negative part.
Yeah, I mean, evolution's tools are so blunt. Like that thing in us that says like getting criticized is unsafe. I mean, it comes from like something in you thinks that you're going to get like cast out of society to like die in the desert, if someone thought that your tour should have gone slightly differently. And like this trying to solve that, people will, especially if you read like entrepreneur tips or like tips for doing one-on-ones with your manager, even if you're petrified or whatever, they're like, oh, you can reframe this. Like you can decide that this is actually, you're excited to like get better and you need this special, valuable tool. And by the way, they're going to be criticizing you, but like it's actually special and valuable and like educational. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. I mean, you can try that. Reframing is not nothing. That's the cognitive element in like cognitive
Hmm.
behavioral therapy. But people sometimes operate under the illusion that like if you do that, then that will take care of the whole thing. Like the whole negative emotion will be gone or transmuted into excitement or enthusiasm or whatever. And like that has never been my experience. I have a cynic's view. I'm like, okay, we'll reframe what we can and like we'll just kind of sit with the rest and yep, just do that over and over and over. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I think understand that in the end, the action taken is so important, right? And this is in effect what really reinforces behavior is the action you take and how you're going to feel about it. And then if we mention acts of courage or bravery of seeing the thing that is looming over us and we perceive as dreadful, and yet dealing with it because we have a good conception of what is of what the right thing to do is. This is a major positive positive piece of feedback to keep going in that way. And I think another trait is what I mentioned, like looking back and seeing, I was fearful about when I was about to do the right thing, but I did that. And just having this internal integrity and self appreciation and self love, where you take care of yourself and not go down the path of least resistance, in the case if you have some sort of obsessive disorder. Um, yeah, so I really like that. What in terms of is there anything that we haven't covered in that you can think of in terms of the topic of negative emotions and why they shouldn't necessarily be avoided, but even like for me, it's very clear they should be embraced when the situation calls for them.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the devil's all in the details there, which is, as you say, when the situation calls for it, is like there's an element of judgment that is so inextricable, um, where it's like some negative emotions really are important guides to action. And like, I wouldn't deny that. And maybe a theme that some people listening to this would be interested in is there's this emerging kind of school of thought around productivity in our corner of Twitter that is
Yes.
non-coercive, non-self-coercive, um, for productivity and really kind of for life generally. And I'm so ambivalent about this because on the one hand, I agree that if your only fuel is like self-inflicted negative emotion and trying to avoid it, like that is something that is not likely to work that well and is also probably more painful than life really has to be. But the positive vision there, which is like you could somehow not be like sort of annoyed with yourself for letting something slip that was very important or like misprioritizing or wasting time, like is similarly unrealistic. um So how my views on this look just really depend on what I'm reacting to. If it's like someone who's super into like happy as positive emotion, then I'm gonna play up the negative stuff. But in other
Mm-hmm.
contexts, like
Mm-hmm.
yeah, maybe life doesn't have to be so miserable. Maybe those times avoiding the negative emotion is really fine and not gonna lead to some spiral that makes you of not in touch with reality and obsessive compulsive and all these things. It just requires so much judgment. That's why I like working with people one-on-one in my coaching practice, is because many of them have consumed all manner of very abstract content around like, oh, you could and should feel this happy, or you could and should like force yourself to do all these things and call that productivity. And it's like, well, we have to figure it out, and we have to figure out like for you individually. um, no good guidelines at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this takes me back to what you said about effective altruism, and I still think that if you look into the tenets of the movement, you can find no fault with it. But then, of course, you hit apply, and real people are going in there and become part of the movement, and you have a social circle that where people radicalize themselves, as in any kind of group that is based around an ideology, and all of a sudden from these like pure tenets comes out sort of a monstrous thing, right, which is not helping for the people themselves, because again, as we said, for as long as you're trying to optimize for things, you are anxious about these things, and if you're anxious, you're not living well, you're missing the point. And this is just, I think it's important to remember that you I think without exception but I won't say that, but we generally don't want to optimize for things, because to follow a healthy regimen means to do the right thing at the right time, the right thing at the right time, the right thing at the right time, and in succession. And the optimal state for us is health, which, as I said, can be defined in negative terms of just the absence of illness. And that's just something that emerges from a pattern of doing the right thing. So you don't have to worry about what emerges. What will
Mhm.
emerge from the sum of all my actions is not something that should concern you that much. You should be concerned with doing the right thing. And that is a daily and sometimes, an hourly thing that we have to think about.
Yeah, yeah. And part of what's happening when you see a group of people who are aligned in some like legible way, they may not be actually experiencing the same thing. Like the phenomenology of pursuing an ideal, like effective altruism or being vegan or anything, can be quite diverse internally. So, like,
Mm,
some of them really may be not anxious. They may be sort of motivated in a positive, like a pull sense towards the goals, like waking up excited. Like, this is totally possible. I'm excited to like wake up and do my work to like save people's lives now and improve the far future. Like, that is totally possible. But to turn someone into a maximizer who isn't sort of already, I think much more often involves inducing anxiety or shame. Like, I taught critical thinking and intro ethics when I was still in academia, and you could always tell there would be a few people in the class where like if you introduce them to like an act utilitarianism or like the history of
mm-hmm.
utilitarianism, it was like flipping a switch. But they
Uh-huh.
weren't pulled in by like the aesthetic and like emotional moral beauty of like a improving the world. They were just like, oh god, everything I've ever done is literally wrong, and I have to make it's like they're on fire in that anxiety way. Like, I have to do whatever it takes to like not be on fire morally anymore. And that is a state of like extreme anxiety and emotional avoidance where like you can't sit with the gray area that like maybe you are making trade-offs in favor of yourself or near ones versus someone else. Like, in some sense that's true, but you have to just like get it off you, like get the moral gray area off of you as soon as possible. And the things people reach for at those times tend not to be um, healthy on balance or healthy or stable in the long run.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the point you just made about, how it's different for different people for sure. And I think just as you say, some of the people come and approach it from a healthy place for sure. And I couldn't not notice that you've used the fire metaphor twice when talking about the kind of thing that is calling out to you from the unsanitized walls, and for the people that. So I just wanted to point out and say that's interesting too, how people metaphorize their kind of feelings and their internal place. I just want to say it's so different than mine, and it's lovely. Like I love seeing how we're different, and each of us takes it in a different direction.
Sure. I mean, some people use fired up as like excited, right?
Uh
Like
huh.
that positive thing. Like I wake up, I'm like fired up, I'm like charged up, electricity, energy, like good. For me, it's kind of like the sense that it's bad, it's only getting worse. Like my skin is crawling and like my face. These are the somatic, like correlates of some of these like anxiety and panic. But what the fire means to me is really like you have to put it out and it is very urgent. Like if you notice a fire around you, like you can't just kind of like be okay with that. It's like an extreme emergency, and some things really do deserve that level of attention, but most of the things that have presented to me as fires were not really burning. It's like the smudge I saw on the bathroom wall an hour ago, like requires no action. I don't have to like it. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
fire.
Yeah, it's. I guess it's very timely because you're now speaking to me when I still have a case of hives, which I've never had before.
Oh
But last
no.
night I just became just flooded with these hives, and my whole body was hot. I had to take a cold shower in the middle of the night, and I just described this to my wife. It was like it feels like I'm on fire, and it's really like the annoying part is that there's no running away from it. Literally, it
Mhm.
doesn't matter right now if I'm going to sit by the computer or do this or do that. It's not going away, and I'm just scratching myself to death. And she just very immediately said, "It's like, oh yeah, like what people with anxiety feel like." And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, it's a good way of kind of giving me an idea what it might feel like for people." So now I feel a bit closer to people with the fire metaphor and about how uncomfortable it is. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Pamela, let me say I really enjoyed this conversation, and it was amazingly insightful. And I'm very thankful for you for to you for sharing your personal story, which is to me very very optimistic and very very uplifting. And yeah, so thank you first of all.
Thank you so much. I was so glad to be here. Glad we connected.
And yeah, and in terms of what you do, where you write, if you'd like to share with listeners where they can find you and get in touch, then please.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone can find me at PamelaJHobart.com and on Twitter at AmlaPay.
Nice, and these will be linked, of course. Yeah, great Joy, and to next time.
That's what the J is. My middle name is Joy.
Ah, serendipity.
Ironic, yeah. Thanks so much, Al.